And there were so many questions afterwards. And because in our series on what does it mean to be a reconciling community, we talked about that before, what does it mean to kind of have a balanced perspective in the world and to create wholeness in the world, one of those pieces are, how do we relate to other religious groups? I mean, are we it, or do we live lives that are inclusive of other religions? And so as I was approaching that theme, I thought it would be kind of interesting to fold in some of Randy's perspective and to help sort of elaborate or broaden the presentation a bit from the vantage point of where Randy comes from. And I don't know, Randy, if you have to be so much into the Jungian stuff today unless you want to be, but it's partly just from your own personal experience too. If you could share from that, that would be great. So a couple of issues that I want to do today. One is to talk about what does it mean to, hey, hi Lori. What does it mean to...
Is that Julie and I, or yeah?
Yeah, I know it's Julie. Hey! I want to kind of start with how do we orient ourselves towards other religious traditions? So that's sort of the theme for today. The handout that I gave you is a selection that I read when I was back in college, so when I was years and years ago, that I still think is pretty relevant today and we're still trying to live into. So you can take that home and read it if you'd like, but it's really helpful, I think, to get one perspective. I'll talk a little bit about his perspective. But where I wanted to begin was one of the pieces that I think helps absorb different religious perspectives is the way in which you hold your own. So if you hold your own religious perspective in a particular way, it can cause you some grief in the way in which you embrace the perspective of others. And I would suggest that many people, when they're born into a faith, approach that faith from what we call the first naivete. It's all the world to them. It's like where you grew up. You know, so when I grew up in my family's household, I only knew this household system, I only knew this neighborhood. It was the world to me, right? And I gave myself and loved that world because it was the only world I knew. Then when I went off to college, or went away from home, you've all experienced this, right? You leave home and you get a second look at your home when you come back, right? You see it in, oh my goodness, we were really living in a rural setting. And oh, I didn't realize we were in this socioeconomic, classification. And I didn't realize my parents were like the way they were, right? I'm able to re-see my own home with a new set of eyes in what they call the second naivete. Now, I'm still passionate about it, but I can see it differently, and I can hold it differently, I can frame it differently. And many would suggest that the same thing has to happen in religion. You know, it's one thing to be immersed in a system so much that you're caught up in it. It's another thing to get some distance from it so you can see it clearly from kind of that second naivete perspective, but also still be engaged with it, right? It's not like I don't have a home anymore. It's just I have a home that looks different to me because I've got a different set of eyes. And I think that's that's something that we should all continue to wrestle with, is how do we appropriate our own religious system? For some of us, where we were born into it, but for others of it, how do we step back far enough to kind of see it again differently and then approach it? And so my question for you, Randy, a little bit, because you've gone through this clearly, right, is what is your perspective on both maybe how to move out of that primary view of your religion in that first naivete, and what are some of the steps to moving into a second vision of that, so that you can hold it, but you hold it with some critical consciousness as well. Can you reflect a little bit of that on your own experience? He didn't know what I was going to ask him today, so when he goes,
Well, yeah, that's you're talking about two steps, really, in a process.
Yeah, sure.
So the first step is, how do you move out of the, I don't know if you can even state it that way. How do you? It sort of happens. First naivete sort of breaks down. It breaks down on its own.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of us. It's not like we're out there, we're in it and we're looking for a way to transcend it. We're in it, and the frame that we're trying to interpret all our experience and put it all in that template or frame starts to kind of get bulgy at the edges, and then at a certain point maybe one one more experience that doesn't fit the paradigm
Yeah.
happens, and then the frame breaks,
Yeah.
and then now you're stuck because you have to create a new frame for your experience.
Yeah. Does that make sense? I mean, you some of
That's
you.
kind of what happens.
Yeah. And can you point to the?
Could you please introduce our guest?
I did already, but you. So I could do it again. Randy Berardi is a member of our congregation. He's a PhD in, what was the PhD in?
Philosophy and religion.
Philosophy and religion. He was our guest speaker at the last Wine and Tapas, along with another speaker to talk about Buddhism. And so I decided to drag him in today to have this conversation. Does that help again? Do you all, can you resonate with that? That you're actually, your first naivete sort of implodes rather than you strategically thinking, I must get out of this mess? Or whatever it is, maybe it's not a mess, maybe it's comfortable, right?
Yeah, there's a theory, I think it's Piaget, is that correct, about
Yeah.
adapting.
Correct.
You know, you adapt, we all have a template, a frame for our reality, whatever, even if it's not stated, we have one.
Yeah.
And then we adapt, our experience is adapted to the frame. And then we adapt until somehow the frame doesn't fit anymore, and it's usually a series, and then it breaks, and then we have to adopt a new frame.
Ah, got it,
So
got it.
that's part of growing.
Yeah, right. That's healthy. And then how would you then go into the, how would then you take steps to have more of a, to think more critically about your faith system?
Well,
Is
I
that
think-
more, do you think that clearly is a more conscious level of work, I would think?
It is a more conscious level of
Yeah.
work, and I think you're, like I say, you're kind of forced into it. I was a fundamentalist Pentecostal Christian for a number of years, and I still have a high regard for many aspects of the Pentecostal tradition I
Right.
came out of. But at some point, I guess I would say, without trying to be unkind, that the incongruities became sort of egregious, not only in terms of what the theological claims and statements were, but in terms of the practices, not sort of matching up. And so that sort of sent me on my way to the more critical. And I want to be careful with the word critical, because we have a sort of prosaic use of the word critical, meaning to criticize or to be negative. But there is a whole critical discipline and a whole scholarly side of that, where there's a critical approach to Scripture and to the tradition, the history, and it simply means to use the analytical skills of the historian, the social scientist, cultural historian, to look at the context, as you say, you know, to put it in its own time and place. To me, context is everything.
Right.
Context really speaks, and it gives you dimensions and insights and perspectives on things that, without context, sort of have an absolutism about them. And that context sort of relativizes things, begins to relativize things. And it helps you see things in relation to other things.
Right.
And that can be tremendously helpful.
Yeah. Does that make sense? So so when I went back home, I saw my family system, my neighborhood, my parents' political orientation, their religious affiliation, our economic standing, in the context of a larger, I was able to contextualize it, and that helped me to see it more clearly in some ways. And to hold it maybe differently. And to do the same thing with your religious perspective, I think sometimes, I will admit, some of the first steps in that sometimes feels like heresy, right? Because you feel as if, who am I to question, you know, the very absolutes that I got raised up in? And you can feel a little shamed by that. I met with a woman the other day, and she was, you know, she's in her 80s or 90s, and she's still trying to work this incongruence about how God is gracious and yet so much evil happens in the world. You know, she's still wrestling with that, as if it keeps bumping up into her worldview of God, and not sure how to adapt a different way of thinking about it. So I don't know that it's age-related as much as it is, like you say, sort of over the course of time, certain experiences line up, and you're like, I can't get this to fit anymore. And then, I don't know, for those of you who have left, have you felt some level of shame or anxiety about stepping away from that system? Anybody had that experience?
Absolutely.
There's one.
Yeah.
What was that shame like? I mean, why do you think it was so difficult for you?
I think, you know, just depend. Part of me was thinking while you guys were talking about how much is sort of questioning and thinking about things from a different perspective accepted from the get-go in your initial religious experience. And I
Yeah.
feel like I talked to some people and there was a higher level of that in their, you know, their home, if you want to call
Right,
it
their
that.
base, yeah.
Their base. And to me, for me anyway, there was no questioning encouraged, and I bought into that. Maybe that's because of kind of who I am, as well as that, you know, that combined. So it did really feel bad to question, because even questioning had been defined as not okay.
Right.
So I think that was part of it for me. And just coming to the place of saying, you know, no, it is okay. God can handle it. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, so, and then feeling a tremendous freedom, and wow, when I finally got over that anxiety and shame, to say, oh, this is very cool. So it's been worth it, but it was, you know, very hard for me.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, yeah. You know, these systems and these realities have their boundaries and their taboos. And
Yeah.
so, you know, when things are marked taboo, you don't go there. And, and for Jung was really big on this, actually. He had a lot to say about it, because that's really what creates the shadow. The shadow consists of all of those elements that are taboo, where you don't go there. But they don't go away. So let's just take the notion of...
Yeah, give an example. Maybe.
Well, questioning,
Right.
being analytical.
Right.
In a tradition that is really faith-centered, where faith is really more of a feeling, or it's more of an intuitive, or it's more of just a sort of something you adhere to in obedience, let's say.
Right.
Faithfulness. So the analytical side then is not really valued. Not only is it not valued, in a way it's sort of tabooed.
Yeah.
And so it goes off into the shadow, but it doesn't go away. And so for a lot of us, we spend a lot of energy pushing down, pushing away all of the things that are trying to come up into consciousness.
Right.
And for Jung, this is the shadow. And what he suggests is that in some of these highly, especially with the high moral accent, where you have the all light and the all dark, you know, you get this polarization. And then these energies become demonized in a way. And the more you push, the further away, the more energy they start to develop as a countermeasure. And so they start to press harder and harder and harder.
Right.
And the more fanatic you are, pardon me over here, I got top of my hand.
Yeah, I can tell. You should have this fight.
The more, you know, the more fanatical or one-sided you are over here, the more powerful the energies are over there.
Yeah,
and
that
they're
makes sense.
sure to come in what he says is it comes in an autonomous way. We don't plan it. It seems like it happens to us. Something happens to us in life. Some circumstance, some event, someone comes into our life, something happens, and boom, you know, out comes all of this stuff, and we have this complete turnaround.
Wow.
And so that's a lot of times what happens. He had a
Right.
name for that, but and you know, we become the opposite.
Right.
And what Jung is trying to do is get us away from this push-pull of the opposites and try to move us more into a middle where we're having, in a sense, our own inner conversation
Right.
among these disparate elements. So we try to find some unity.